October 25th, 1944, off the eastern coast of the Philippines. Dawn breaks over the Leyte Gulf in a haze of diesel smoke and salt spray. The sea is restless, rolling under a blood-orange sky. On the horizon, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 38 moves like a floating city of steel and thunder. Essex-class carriers, cruisers, and destroyers lined in perfect symmetry. Their wakes gleam like molten glass beneath the first light of day. On the deck of the USS St. Lo CVE-63, Seaman First Class Richard Red Maddox wipes a film of oil and sweat from his face. He's been awake for 36 hours, working the flight deck, refueling Wildcats and Avengers as fast as they land. The engines never stop. The air smells of exhaust and cordite. "Looks like another calm one, huh?" his buddy shouts over the roar of a warming F4F. Maddox laughs, but the sound feels hollow. Nothing's calm anymore. At 10:30 hours, radar operators aboard the carrier Kitcoon Bay pick up multiple inbound blips low and fast. Within minutes, word spreads through the task group, bogies inbound bearing 075 range 20 miles. The men on the St. Lo glance at each other. They've heard rumors Japanese pilots who don't break off who aim their aircraft straight into the ships. No one wants to believe it. They're about to. At 10:53, the first one hits. From the bridge of this Kalinan Bay, Lieutenant Commander D.H. Fox watches a glint in the sun turn into a silver arrow. It's a Mitsubishi A6M5 zero-diving vertically engine screaming at full throttle. Hard to port, Fox yells. Too late. The Zero slams into the aft deck, its 500-pound bomb detonating in a blinding fireball. Steel plates buckle like paper. A plume of black smoke rises 1,000 feet into the air. Seconds later, more come, 5, 10, 20 of them diving out of the sun in waves. The sky fills with tracer fire and shrapnel. It's not an attack. It's a storm made of men and metal. "Jesus, they're crashing on purpose," someone screams. The word spreads like wildfire. Kamikaze, divine wind. On the St. Lo, alarms wail. Gun crews sprint to their 40mm mounts, the barrels already hot from the morning's raids. Maddox throws himself behind the nearest hatch, combing, as the first aircraft streaks low over the bow. Bearing 080 coming in fast. The Oerlikons chatter, spitting fire into the sky. The Zero explodes, mid-air fragments raining across the deck. Another gets through. It hits the port elevator, detonating its bomb deep below. The ship lurches, the world turning sideways. Flames roar from the hangar bay. Maddox staggers to his feet. His helmet, a simple steel pot issued when he joined, slips sideways, useless against the shockwave. His ears ring, his vision doubles. He barely hears the scream of another aircraft diving. And then mercifully silence. The St. Lo is gone within 20 minutes. The explosion from her bomb-laden hangar blows her deck apart in 2 tremendous bursts, flinging sailors into the sea. From nearby destroyers, survivors watch as the escort carrier's stern lifts skyward, the white letters on her hull vanishing beneath the smoke. A radio man aboard the Herman whispers into his headset, "They just keep coming." No one answers. That day, the first official kamikaze attacks sink one carrier and cripple several others. Over 4,000 men are killed or wounded. For the sailors who survive, one question burns through the fear and shock. How can you fight a weapon that doesn't fear death? Thousands of miles away in San Francisco, a man who has never seen combat sits at his drafting table. His name is Edward W. Bullard, age 63, naval engineer, inventor, and founder of the E.D. Bullard Company. Around him, the office smells of sawdust and machine oil. On the wall hangs a photograph of his father, who designed the first industrial hard hat for miners in 1919. Bullard has spent his life improving it, studying concussive force impact distribution and the psychology of safety. But now the Navy's Bureau of Ships has sent him something new, a memo marked urgent, War Department request. Inside are grainy photos of burned helmets recovered from the St. Lo wreckage, warped like tin cans. He studies them for a long time, jaw tight. "They need more than steel," he murmurs. "They need time to survive the blast." And in that moment, an idea begins to form, one that will sound impossible to everyone else. By late 1944, the Pacific War has entered its most brutal phase. The Allies have clawed across the Marianas, shattered the Imperial Navy at Leyte, and now prepare for the invasions of Luzon and Okinawa. But every victory brings heavier losses from kamikazes. The Japanese, running out of planes and trained pilots, have turned suicide into strategy. Between October 1944 and June 1945, more than 800 kamikaze sorties will strike the Allied fleet. Over 50 ships will be sunk. Nearly 400 more will be damaged. Every man on those decks, gunners, machinists, signalmen, lives with the same nightmare that in a single heartbeat, fire and shock will take everything. Bullard begins sketching in silence. His pencil moves quickly, shaping the curve of a helmet thicker, here flared there with a suspended inner lining. But this one is different. He adds layers, a steel outer shell, a shock-absorbing resin composite inside a webbed harness that holds the helmet slightly above the skull to diffuse impact. He adds a chin strap and a heat-resistant coating borrowed from the materials used in fireman's gear. Then he stops and writes one line in the margin: "If a man can keep consciousness, he can save others." It's not about armor. It's about survival in those seconds after impact. When Bullard presents the prototype to Navy officials, they're skeptical. "It's too heavy," one officer says. "Sailors won't wear it." "It'll save their skulls," Bullard replies evenly. Another frowns. "You think a piece of steel and fabric can stop a Zero's bomb?" Bullard slides the helmet across the table. "No, Commander. But it might let him get back up after it hits." They approve a limited trial aboard Pacific Fleet ships. Bullard returns to his workshop, refining the design, adjusting the suspension bands, testing new shock liners made from cellulose fiber. He names it the Navy Mark II protective helmet. By December, shipments begin to arrive at Pearl Harbor. On January 6, 1945, the fleet off Luzon faces another wave. Kamikazes dive from the clouds at dusk, their engines wailing like tortured souls. One crashes into the destroyer Newcomb. Another hits the battleship California, setting her superstructure ablaze. Amid the chaos, damage control teams work through smoke and fire. Many wear Bullard's new helmets. For the first time, medics notice the difference: concussions without fractures, burns without brain trauma. Sailors who would have died from shock or debris stay conscious long enough to drag their wounded crewmates to safety. A surgeon aboard the Tennessee writes in his report, "Whatever this new gear is, it keeps men awake when the world goes black." Back in San Francisco, Bullard receives the telegram 3 days later. It's short, but to him, it's everything. "Field reports confirm protective value of your design. Navy requests further production." Stop. He sets it down, takes off his glasses, and exhales. For the first time in months, he allows himself a faint smile. He doesn't know it yet, but by war's end, his invention will save hundreds, perhaps thousands of sailors during the hellfire of Okinawa. And the legend of a civilian who dared to defy the impossible will ripple quietly through the Navy for decades. February 1945, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. The Pacific sun beats down on rows of men in blue denim, the clang of hammers and the hiss of welders echoing across dry dock number 2. Half a dozen destroyers lie open to the air, their decks scattered with new gear offloaded from San Francisco. Among the crates stamped ED, Bullard Compton, San Francisco, California, sit hundreds of unfamiliar helmets, sleek, flared, dull gray. Chief Boatswain's mate Harold Swede Jensen lifts one from a crate and whistles. Looks like someone crossed a soup pot with a fireman's lid. A petty officer nearby smirks. "Word is these are supposed to stop your skull from bouncing when a Zero turns your ship inside out." "Right," Jensen mutters, turning it over in his hands. The inside surprises him, a woven suspension cradle-tight webbing, floating just below the steel shell like a spider's web designed to catch a falling man. The first time he puts it on, it feels odd, balanced, not heavy, the rim flaring down over his ears. A Navy inspector watching from the dock nods. "Gentlemen, that's the Mark II. Learn to love it. You'll be wearing it soon enough." That afternoon, a group of sailors gathers in a testing shed. Navy engineers have rigged up a strange contraption, a steel pendulum with a weighted hammerhead. On a table below sits a Mark II helmet beside an older M1 combat model. The engineer in charge, Lieutenant Robert Firth, reads from his clipboard. Impact test velocity 14 feet per second. He releases the pendulum. The hammer crashes onto the old M1 with a sharp metallic crack. The steel shell dents inward nearly an inch. The suspension web snaps, the liner splintering. Firth replaces it with the new helmet and resets the pendulum. Again, the hammer slams down, clang, and rebounds harmlessly. The steel flexes, but the liner holds. Shock-absorbed, Firth says simply. Less than a quarter of transmitted force. The men murmur. Swede Jensen runs a hand over the unbroken shell expression, changing from doubt to something close to awe. The Navy orders 10,000 units immediately. By March, production lines in California and Virginia run day and night. Bullard personally oversees the adjustments, improved chin straps, lighter alloys, better heat resistance. He writes in his notebook, "Every ounce of comfort buys another minute of life." For the first time, the Navy begins issuing safety directives beyond the front lines. Helmets, fireproof gloves, asbestos jackets, protective measures once dismissed as impractical now become doctrine. Damage control teams are trained not only to fight fire, but to survive it. At the Bureau of Ships in Washington, a tired commander reviewing reports mutters, "It took a civilian to make us realize the Navy isn't made of steel, it's made of men." By March 1945, the Pacific War is entering its final, most punishing stage. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, looms ahead. It will be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific campaign, and everyone knows what that means. The kamikazes will come again. In preparation, the new helmets are distributed across the fleet. Each crate bears a stamped serial number and a card that reads, "Property of U.S. Navy Protective Helmet Mark II, for use by all deck and fire parties." A destroyer escorting the fleet southward opens its first shipment. A bosun grins, tapping the rim of his new gear. "If this thing keeps my brains inside my head, I'll wear it to bed." Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Bullard continues to push his designs further. His workshop hums with the sound of prototypes being tested, ballistic drops, concussive blasts, heat exposure. He's no longer satisfied with just the Mark II. He begins experimenting with composite sandwiching, layering resin-treated fiber between sheets of thin steel to create a shell that flexes under shock but refuses to crack. The Navy resists, citing cost and complexity, but Bullard insists. "You can rebuild a ship," he tells one admiral visiting the plant. "You can't rebuild a sailor's head." The admiral studies him for a moment, then simply nods. March 19, 1945, off the Japanese home islands. The carrier USS Franklin CV-13 steams through choppy seas, her deck loaded with armed aircraft preparing for a strike on Kobe. At 07:08 hours, 2 Japanese dive bombers slip through the morning haze. Within seconds, the Franklin becomes a floating inferno. 2 500-pound bombs rip through her hangar, detonating hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel. Planes erupt in chained explosions. Flames leap 4 stories high. On the deck, chaos reigns. Sailors stagger through smoke and shrapnel, ears bleeding from the concussive blasts. The new helmets are everywhere, painted gray, streaked with soot. Men wearing them stumble, fall, rise again. They can still hear, still move, still think. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taylor of the Franklin's damage control team later reports, "The helmets kept men on their feet who'd have been dead on impact. Some couldn't even stand after the shock, but their heads weren't split open. That day, 724 sailors die, but 600 survive. The ship, though gutted, remains afloat." In his San Francisco office, Bullard receives the Franklin report late that week. He reads the casualty summary in silence, then circles a single line in pencil. "Survivors credited improved protective gear for maintaining consciousness post-blast." He exhales slowly. "Not perfect," he whispers, "but better." He knows Okinawa is coming. He's already read the intelligence briefs, hundreds of Japanese planes hidden in caves, trained suicide pilots waiting for the fleet. The Navy will face the deadliest air assault in its history. He leans over his desk and begins another drawing. Reinforced ear flanges, flame-resistant inner lining, quick-release straps for medics. His son, Edward Jr., watches quietly from the doorway. "Pop, don't you ever stop." Bullard doesn't look up, not until they do. April 1st, 1945, Operation Iceberg begins. Over 1,500 Allied ships surround Okinawa. For 82 days, they will endure constant attack. Kamikazes descend in groups of 5, 10, sometimes 50 from dawn to dusk. Ships burn, sink, survive, and fight on. And everywhere among the wreckage, sailors crawl through flame and shrapnel, stunned, bleeding, but alive because a 63-year-old engineer a continent away decided impossible wasn't good enough. By the campaign's end, over 368 Allied vessels will be damaged or sunk. But among the survivors, a pattern emerges: ships whose crews wore Bullard's helmets record significantly higher survival and recovery rates. It's not a weapon. It's not armor. It's hope made of steel and sweat. In June, a Navy report concludes, the Bullard design proved instrumental in reducing head injuries and loss of consciousness during blast and impact. Recommendation: full adoption for all surface fleet personnel. In one line, a civilian's vision becomes Navy standard. Edward Bullard never visits a battlefield. He never hears a kamikaze's scream. But through his invention, he stands beside every sailor who does. And by summer 1945, his impossible idea has become as vital to survival as the ships themselves. April 6, 1945, off Okinawa's western coast. The sea boils under a pale sky. From the decks of hundreds of Allied ships, gunners squint toward the horizon. The radar screens are already alive with blips, hundreds of them moving fast. The airmen of Japan's Kikusui floating chrysanthemum operation are coming. Aboard the destroyer USS Bush DD-529, Lieutenant J.G. Robert Harkness grips the railing, eyes locked on the eastern sky. His throat is dry despite the humid air. "Here they come," he mutters. The horizon flashes small dots growing into the angular outlines of Zeros, Oscars, and Judys diving low through sunlight. Then the radios erupt. All ships, general quarters, bogies, inbound, multiple vectors. Open fire, open fire. The calm sea transforms into an explosion of movement. Tracer streams crisscross the sky. Anti-aircraft bursts pepper the air like flak rain. The first wave hits the outer destroyer screen, 25 Japanese aircraft diving almost vertically. One crashes into the Bush's stern at 16:45 hours. The deck heaves. Flame erupts from the aft mount. The concussion hurls men off their feet. Harkness stumbles across the deck, ears ringing. He tastes blood. Around him, sailors scramble for hoses, fire extinguishers, anything to fight the inferno. The air is a haze of diesel smoke and cordite. Through it all, something remarkable stands out. The men aren't collapsing. They're moving. Bruised, concussed, burned, but conscious. A gunner shouts, "Keep the line. We can still save her." Many of them wear Bullard's new Mark II helmets, the gray steel dulled by soot. When another explosion rips through the forward magazine, the men brace. The shock slams them to the deck, but moments later they're back up, staggering, shouting orders, fighting on. Waterlines ruptured. Keep pumping. Don't quit. The destroyer burns for hours, her engines finally dying at dusk. Only then does the captain give the order to abandon ship. Of the 227 aboard, 87 survive, nearly all from the damage control sections. Later, medical officers record a strange consistency. Men pulled from the wreckage have fractured ribs, burns, even shrapnel wounds, but their skulls are intact. April 12th, the Bush is gone, but the attacks continue without pause. At 09:30 that morning, the USS Laffey DD-724 steams near Okinawa's Hagushi anchorage. She's been nicknamed the ship that would not die, though the crew doesn't know yet how true that title will become. The first wave of kamikazes appears out of the sun, 11 planes diving almost simultaneously. The gunners open fire guns, glowing red-hot barrels vibrating like tuning forks. 2 Zeros crash into the deck, setting off secondary explosions. A third slams into the bridge. The ship shudders, metal twisting. Ensign John Garvey, stationed at Mount 41, feels the world turn upside down. His ears pop. He hits the deck hard, stunned. He blinks and realizes he's still alive. His Mark II helmet is dented but intact. He drags himself upright, blood running down his face. Get the hoses. Keep those magazines cool. The Laffy takes 6 direct kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes in less than 90 minutes. Fires rage across the ship, but the crew refuses to abandon her. A signalman later writes in his report, "We'd have been unconscious after the second hit if not for those helmets. Half the crew would have been gone before the fires were out." When the smoke clears, the Laffy is still afloat, scarred, blackened, but alive. Across the Pacific, at his San Francisco office, Edward Bullard reads the after-action reports coming by cable. Each is stamped secret, but one line stands out in bold pencil from a Navy physician's note. Protective equipment has increased survival rates during kamikaze attacks by up to 70% among deck personnel. He sets the page down slowly. For the first time, he lets himself sit back, the exhaustion catching up to him. His secretary, Mary, peers into the office. "You all right, sir?" He nods, smiling faintly. They called it impossible, but they're still fighting. April 16th, the USS Intrepid takes a hit just off the bow. A Japanese dive bomber slams into her flight deck, detonating its bomb amid refueling lines. Fire consumes the forward elevator. On the hangar deck, a fireman named Petty Officer 3rd Class Alan Peters wakes to find the world glowing orange. His helmet has been blown halfway off. The rim is dented inward, leaving a crease like a scar. He blinks through the smoke, disoriented. Someone yells, "Get those hoses on the fuel lines." He stumbles up, grabs a nozzle, and joins the fight. Hours later, medics discover his helmet caved in nearly an inch, the skull beneath unbroken. Peters survives, so does the Intrepid. By the end of April, the Pacific is littered with wreckage destroyers, gutted carriers, scarred escort ships reduced to twisted steel. Yet the fleet endures. Each report tells the same quiet truth: the Navy is learning to survive fire itself. In Honolulu, a staff officer remarks to a correspondent from Stars and Stripes, "They keep sending men into hell, and the only reason they walk out again is because some old engineer back in California decided heads were worth saving." At Okinawa, kamikaze raids intensify. May brings worse than anyone imagined. The USS Bunker Hill is struck by 2 aircraft in less than 30 seconds. Both are carrying 550-pound bombs. The ship erupts in a fireball so massive it can be seen for 50 miles. Over 600 men die. But among the survivors, doctors notice something unusual. The majority of those who escaped the initial blast were damage control sailors wearing Mark II helmets and flame-retardant jackets. One lieutenant writes in his diary that night, "If you were wearing Bullard's gear, you lived long enough to drag someone else out. If you weren't, God help you." In Washington, Bullard's name finally reaches the desks of admirals and congressmen. A report circulates titled, "Protective Innovations in Naval Warfare." Beneath the heading, Edward W. Bullard, Civilian Contributor, U.S. Navy, Material Command, Provisional. An annotation in pencil reads, "Recommend commendation. Civilian design directly responsible for measurable survival increases during ongoing Pacific operations." Bullard never sees it. He's already at his desk designing improvements for post-war use: fire helmets, construction gear, mining protection. He tells his son quietly, if it works in war, it should work in peace. June 1945, the last kamikaze attacks fade with the collapse of Okinawa's defenses. The cost, 12,500 Allied dead and wounded, over 4,900 Japanese pilots lost. But for the first time, shipboard survival rates in major blasts exceed 60%. No one on deck ever meets the man who made it possible. Yet his fingerprints are everywhere, in every dented helmet that saved a life, in every sailor who lived to write home. And as the Navy prepares for what it thinks will be the next invasion, Japan itself, there's quiet confidence across the fleet. Because now they know they can endure the fire. June 1945, East China Sea. The typhoon season has begun, and the sea itself seems to conspire against the living. The horizon blurs under rolling clouds, the water black and streaked with foam. Amid this chaos, the Allied Armada still holds position off Okinawa. 300 ships packed into an area barely 60 miles wide. their decks scorched and patched from months of kamikaze attacks. At dawn, radar operators aboard the destroyer USS Callahan DD-792 spot movement, small dots appearing just above the waves closing fast. Another warning blares across the fleet: air raid, bogies inbound, low-level, multiple contacts. The men on deck already know what that means. Kikusui, the 10th and final mass kamikaze assault is underway. The Callahan's 40mm Bofors open up their tracers, cutting through the drizzle. For hours, the battle rages like an echo of all that's come before: smoke sirens and the steady pounding rhythm of anti-aircraft fire. Then near midnight, an Aichi D-3A Val slips through the defensive screen. It comes in low, its wings nearly touching the Wave's engine, coughing from flak hits. The Callahan's guns hammer away, but the plane keeps coming, burning, braking, unstoppable. It crashes into the aft deck. The bomb detonates in the after engine room. Fire races through the corridors like wind through dry grass. Chief Radio Man Thomas Ridley wakes to a blast that rips his headphones off. His station fills with flame. He dives to the floor, hands over his head. The shockwave slams into him like a wall. For a moment he feels nothing, just ringing in his ears and the smell of fuel. Then he's alive. Barely. He staggers to his feet, his head pounding. The steel bulkhead beside him is twisted inward, splattered with molten paint. His helmet, the gray flared Mark II, has a dent deep enough to hold a coin. Without it, his skull would have been pulp. He pulls another radio man out from under a collapsed beam, blood streaming down both their faces. "Come on!" Ridley shouts, dragging him toward the ladder. Above them, sailors are already fighting the fire. Many stumble through smoke, dazed but conscious, clutching hoses and extinguishers. The helmets gleam faintly under the inferno's light. For 3 hours they fight. And then, like a dying breath, the Callahan rolls her hull, shuddering. At 0028, she slips beneath the sea. Of the 300 aboard, 47 survive. Most pulled from the burning water, their heads bleeding, but intact. Far to the north, aboard the fleet carrier, USS Enterprise CV-6, the Navy's most decorated ship of the war, men watch the horizon burn. Even here, in what should have been relative safety, the kamikazes find them. On May 14th, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dives straight into the Enterprise's flight deck, detonating a 550-pound bomb. The explosion rips through the hangar, hurling aircraft and fuel lines into the air. Fire engulfs the ship. The deck tilts 10 degrees. Hundreds are wounded. But when the flames subside, the old carrier still floats. The medical logs that night read like a testament to Bullard's work: many concussions, few fatalities. Helmets absorbed majority of impact. Crew morale high despite severe damage. The Enterprise, though battered, makes it back to Pearl Harbor under her own power. The Navy calls her lucky. Her crew knows better. By June 22, 1945, the Battle of Okinawa ends. The cost defies comprehension: over 12,500 American lives. Yet amid the devastation, a quiet triumph emerges. The Navy has learned to survive its own infernos. The lessons written in fire will shape the future of maritime warfare for generations. In the aftermath, reports from ship surgeons and medical officers fill entire folders at the Bureau of Ships. One memo, unsigned but clearly written by a senior officer, reads, "It is the opinion of this office that the protective equipment introduced in 1944 by Mr. Edward W. Bullard has materially reduced the loss of life due to shock, concussion, and cranial trauma aboard combat vessels. Its contribution cannot be overstated." Thousands of miles away in San Francisco, Edward Bullard sits alone in his office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and stacks of correspondence. It's a gray morning, the fog rolling in over the bay. The war feels distant now, but its echo fills the room. His son enters quietly, carrying a telegram. "Pop, this one's from Washington." Bullard opens it, squinting behind his glasses. The typewritten words are brief. "Department of the Navy commends E.W. Bullard for outstanding civilian contribution to personnel protection during wartime operations." Innovations credited with saving numerous lives. Official commendation to follow. He sets it down slowly. They're just men with words, he murmurs, but those words mean something. His son smiles. You did more than most who wore the uniform. Bullard doesn't answer. He looks toward the window where the fog has begun to lift. Somewhere beyond it, he imagines the ships still steaming home through Pacific waters, their decks alive with men who'll live to see another sunrise. In the Pacific, that sunrise is real. The war at sea is over. The kamikazes are gone. The sky above Okinawa, once filled with smoke, is empty now, only gulls circling the waves where ships once burned. On the deck of the USS Missouri, sailors stand at attention as word comes through. Japan has signaled surrender. Seaman Red Maddox, the same man who survived the St. Lo 6 months earlier, leans on the rail helmet dangling from one hand. The steel is scarred, the rim blackened, but it's still whole. He rubs his thumb over a dent the size of a fist. Guess you and me made it, huh? He whispers to the helmet. He'll take it home with him. So will thousands of others. In the months that follow, the Navy's Bureau of Medicine compiles its final Pacific Theater report. A summary appears in the appendix, buried among technical data. Protective Helmet Mark II. Bullard design demonstrated 62% reduction in fatal cranial injury rates aboard surface vessels exposed to direct or near-miss attacks between 1944 to 45. Recommendation retained for post-war fleet. A footnote adds simply, civilian contribution indispensable. By the time the last of the Pacific Fleet returns to San Francisco Bay in September, Bullard's design has become standard issue. His company begins converting to peacetime production fire helmets, construction gear, industrial safety equipment. The old engineer declines all interviews. When asked by a reporter how it feels to have saved lives, he only says it wasn't heroism. It was math and mercy. In the quiet shipyards, sailors unload the gear that carried them through hell. The helmets, dented and scorched, are stacked in rows waiting to be melted down or refitted for peacetime use. But a few are kept souvenirs of survival proof that even in war's darkest hour, human ingenuity could hold back death for one more heartbeat. For every man who wore one, the memory endures. A flash, a shock, a roar, and then consciousness, breath, life. Because somewhere far from the front, a civilian refused to believe that steel was enough. October 1945, San Francisco Naval Shipyard. The war is over, but the docks are still loud with the clang of hammers and the hiss of acetylene torches. Thousands of ships limp home, bent, burned, patched with sheet steel and makeshift welds. Sailors spill down the gangways with duffel bags slung over their shoulders, blinking at a world that somehow feels smaller now. Among them are men carrying strange mementos, helmets dented like relics of another planet, gray steel marked by soot and salt. They keep them not as trophies but as reminders. One of those men is Seaman Richard Red Maddox. He walks the pier with his Mark II under his arm, the rim warped where a kamikaze's blast once knocked him senseless. A shipyard clerk gestures to the disposal bin. You can toss that there, sailor. Navy'll melt it down. Maddox shakes his head. Not a chance. She stays with me. He tucks the helmet under his jacket, boards the train east, and carries it all the way home to Ohio. For him and for thousands like him, it's more than metal. It's the reason they lived to step on land again. In an office 6 miles away, Edward W. Bullard stares out over the fog-draped bay. His desk is crowded with letters from sailors, handwritten notes, photos, even fragments of helmets mailed back with messages scrawled in grease pencil. Your idea kept my head attached. Burned my ship, but I walked out. You never saw us, sir, but we owe you. He reads every one. None go unanswered. His son Edward Jr. joins him, already managing much of the company's day-to-day work. Together, they begin a new line of helmets for civilian industries, firefighting, construction, mining. The design principles that saved sailors will now protect workers at home. Bullard looks at his son across the drafting table. The war's not over, he says softly. It just moved back to the places we build things. 1946, Washington, D.C. At the Bureau of Ships, a small ceremony takes place behind closed doors. Edward Bullard is presented with a framed citation from the Secretary of the Navy. The wording is simple, dignified, for extraordinary technical innovation contributing directly to the preservation of life and the effectiveness of United States naval operations in the Pacific Theater, 1944 to 1945. Bullard in a dark gray suit accepts it quietly. He isn't comfortable with attention. When reporters approach afterward, he deflects. "Gentlemen," he says, "the credit belongs to every sailor who wore the thing and trusted it would work." The photo that runs in the San Francisco Chronicle the next morning shows him half smiling, holding the plaque. The caption reads, "Engineer who gave the Navy its hard hat." He clips it from the paper and files it away without ceremony. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the ruins of Okinawa are still smoldering. Navy engineers and Seabees work among the wreckage, clearing mines and reconstructing airfields. Many still wear their Mark IIs, some out of regulation, others out of habit. One day, a Marine corporal working alongside a Japanese prisoner stops to wipe the sweat from his forehead. The prisoner points to his helmet and says in halting English, "New design." The corporal nods. "Saved a lot of us." The prisoner stares at it for a long moment, then whispers, "Good idea." For a second, they share something neither side can quite name: respect, maybe, or simply exhaustion. In the years that follow, the war fades into textbooks, but Bullard's influence spreads. His steel helmet principle evolves into the first fiberglass and aluminum composite hard hats. Construction firms adopt them after a series of peacetime industrial accidents. Shipyard fires, refinery explosions, collapsed scaffolds. By 1949, the E.D. Bullard Company has transformed from a wartime supplier into a peacetime pioneer of industrial safety. Its motto, painted on the wall above the loading dock, reads, "The life you save may be your own." At the same time, the Navy quietly continues to improve on Bullard's concept. A classified post-war project at the Naval Research Laboratory in Maryland studies the psychological effects of blast trauma. The findings are grim concussive shock waves, not shrapnel, cause nearly half of non-fatal injuries aboard ships hit by suicide planes or near-miss bombs. Bullard's suspension system, the inner webbing that held the helmet just off the scalp, had, without anyone realizing, it acted as a primitive shock isolator, dispersing impact waves through space rather than bone. The Navy's report, dated 1947, states, "Future protective design must emulate the Bullard principle of energy dissipation through air gap and flexible suspension." It becomes the foundation for modern helmet design in aviation firefighting and construction. In 1951, as the Korean War reignites the world's attention, Navy fleet training manuals still include Bullard's name. Chapter 7. Shipboard Damage Control lists the Mark II and its successors as standard protective equipment, required issue for all personnel exposed to deck hazards. In photographs from the era, you can still see them, sailors on the decks of Essex-class carriers off Wonsan, their helmets gleaming in the cold sunlight, nearly unchanged from the models worn at Okinawa. Those men will face new dangers, napalm jet fuel and MiG attacks, but the principle remains the same: protect the mind and the body will follow. For Bullard, the war years remain both pride and burden. He rarely speaks of them. When his company expands into new markets, he insists every product be field-tested personally. If it fails, he tells his engineers, "It fails in my hands first." He becomes an unlikely advocate for worker safety laws, writing to senators, urging mandatory protective equipment on construction sites. Few remember that his obsession began not in politics, but in a war where a helmet meant the line between a man crawling to save his ship or never getting up again. Spring 1953, San Francisco. Bullard walks the docks with his grandson, now a boy of 10. They pass a freighter being loaded for Korea, its crew moving efficiently under cranes and cables. Every man on deck wears a hard hat. The boy looks up. "Grandpa, did you invent that?" Bullard chuckles. "Not really, kid. I just made it hurt less to be alive." The boy frowns, not understanding, but years later he will. On the other side of the Pacific, Okinawa has turned green again. The beaches where ships burned now host children playing in the surf. Fishermen mend their nets on the shore, and the wrecks beneath the water are covered in coral. Diving teams sometimes recover relics, fragments of deck plating, twisted aircraft frames, and occasionally a helmet. When cleaned, the faint stamp still shows Edward Bullard cum SF Caliph. They often end up in museums placed behind glass beside photographs of men smiling through smoke. By the late 1950s, the United States standardizes Bullard's suspension concept across all military and industrial helmets. The design becomes so ubiquitous that few remember where it began or why. Yet every man who ever wore one at sea knows. It started with a civilian who never heard a kamikaze's scream, but who somehow understood what it meant to survive it. And in every hard hat, on every job site, in every fireman's helmet flashing under the lights, a trace of Edward Bullard's impossible idea still lives, a quiet echo of the war that forged it and of the men it saved. Summer 1957, New York Harbor. A humid wind sweeps across the piers, carrying the tang of salt and oil. Cranes groan under the weight of cargo, and freighters from every nation crowd the docks. On one of them, the SS Marine Phoenix, a merchant sailor named Joseph Keating adjusts his faded gray hard hat before climbing into the hold. The hat bears the same stamped letters that once rode across the Pacific: Edward Bullard Company SF Caliph. To the men working the cranes, it's just a piece of gear, a rule of the trade. But Keating knows better. His father served on the Laffey off Okinawa. The old man kept his own helmet on the mantelpiece back home, dented and blackened. As a boy, Joseph used to trace the impact marks with his fingers. Now, as he moves through the noisy, sweating maze of steel containers, he catches his reflection in a polished hatch cover and thinks, funny how something made for war keeps us safe in peace. He doesn't know it, but the idea that saved his father has become invisible through familiarity woven into the fabric of daily life. Thousands of miles away in San Francisco, Edward Bullard sits in the same workshop where it all began. He's older now, his hair thin, his hands spotted from age and years of oil and graphite. The war has faded into sepia photographs, but the letters from sailors still hang framed on the wall. He keeps one always within reach. Dear Mr. Bullard, I was on the Franklin when she blew. You saved my head, sir. My wife says that makes you part of the family. G. Taylor Machinist's mate, 2nd class, U.S. Navy. Bullard runs a thumb along the creased paper and smiles. Part of the family, he murmurs. I suppose that'll do. In 1959, Bullard introduces a new model, the thermoplastic hard hat light, enough to float in water, strong enough to stop falling debris from cranes. Its design is the direct descendant of the Mark II. Same suspension web, same gap of air between skull and shell. At the press unveiling in Los Angeles, a reporter asks Mr. Bullard, "Do you think about the war when you work?" He hesitates. Every time he says, "That's why we keep building." Across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy operates under a different kind of sky now. The Cold War has replaced the hot fury of kamikazes with the constant vigilance of jet-age patrols. Carriers like the Forrestal and Midway are cities unto themselves. Nuclear ordnance and flight decks where jets roar off at twice the speed of the old Wildcats. And yet amid all that power, the simplest things endure. On every deck, sailors wear steel-gray protective helmets modeled after Bullard's wartime design. They call them cranials now, fiberglass shells with soundproofing and straps, but the DNA is unmistakable. During a refueling mishap aboard the Forrestal in 1967, a fireball sweeps across the flight deck, igniting bombs and fuel tanks. In the chaos, several men survived the initial blast because of their cranial gear descendants of the same design that once shielded sailors at Leyte Gulf. An after-action report reads, "Protective headgear contributed materially to retention of consciousness and subsequent fire suppression efforts." The language has changed. The story has not. Bullard doesn't live to see that report. He dies in 1962 at the age of 81, quietly without ceremony. The Navy sends a letter of condolence to his family, noting his service to the fleet through innovation. His son Edward Jr. takes over the company, expanding its reach into international markets. At his funeral in San Francisco, a small group of retired sailors attend uninvited but welcomed. They placed their helmets, scarred, smoke-stained, paint-chipped, on the edge of the coffin before the lid is closed. One of them, an old boatswain from the Intrepid, whispers, "Fair winds, sir. You built something that kept us upright." Years later, during the Vietnam War, the U.S. Navy's riverine patrols use a new version of the same design, lightweight, with ballistic fiber reinforcement. It's known as the Bullard-style Mecha 3. The name remains unofficial but universal. Young sailors wearing it have never heard of Edward Bullard. They don't know his story or the firestorms of Okinawa. But the principle he invented, the buffer between life and death, measured in inches of steel and air, protects them all the same. In Saigon, a Navy medic treating a wounded crewman after a rocket strike notices the dented helmet lying beside him. The liner is torn, the shell fractured, but the sailor is alive. The medic picks it up, reads the faded stamp, and murmurs, "Still doing the job, old man." By the 1970s, the hard hat has become a symbol of labor itself. It's on every construction site, refinery, and shipyard in America. Protesters wear it during marches. Politicians invoke it in speeches about the working class. Few realize it was born from the mind of a man trying to stop sailors from being knocked unconscious by explosions. In a 1974 Popular Mechanics interview, Edward Jr. reflects on that legacy. "Dad never designed for glory. He designed so a man could take one more step after the blast, make one more decision that saved someone else. He used to say, if they stay conscious, they can choose to live." That was his whole religion. Meanwhile, back at Pearl Harbor, a small museum exhibit opens dedicated to naval damage control. Among the photographs and models stands a single dented helmet displayed under glass. The placard reads, "Mark II, Protective Helmet 1944, issued to U.S. Navy damage control personnel. Designed by Edward W. Bullard. Credited with saving hundreds of lives during kamikaze attacks at Okinawa." Visitors walk past without realizing that the small curve of steel before them once changed the course of human endurance. In 1985, the USS Laffey, the same destroyer that survived 6 kamikaze hits, is restored as a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. On her main deck, guides point out the battle scars, the twisted steel plates still bearing heat marks from 1945. Inside a display case near the bridge sits another Bullard helmet, its rim buckled inward, blackened by fire. Beneath it, a card reads, "Recovered from the deck of USS Laffey, April 12, 1945. The sailor who wore this survived all 6 hits. Visitors stare in silence. The tour guide tells them sometimes history isn't about heroes with medals. Sometimes it's about the man who figured out how to keep them alive long enough to earn them. By the 21st century, Bullard's company has become global, producing helmets for miners, firefighters, and engineers on 5 continents. Each still bears the same stamped name, though few pause to wonder who it belonged to. Yet in every clang of metal on scaffolding, every hiss of steam in a refinery, every fireman running through smoke, his legacy lives on. A design born of desperation and war became the blueprint for safety itself. And if you listen close through the roar of machines or the hum of a city at work, you can almost hear it again. The low, steady heartbeat of the idea that refused to die. Spring 1986, Louisville, Kentucky. In a modest auditorium surrounded by glass cases filled with old naval relics, a small ceremony is about to begin. Engineers, Navy veterans, and industrial safety officials gather in folding chairs while a blue banner above the stage reads, "Edward W. Bullard, From Shipyards to Skylines, A Century of Safety." At the center of the stage sits a single artifact, a gray dented Mark II helmet. The room hushes as an elderly man in a naval blazer, Rear Admiral Retmo John Garvey, steps up to the microphone. He clears his throat. "I was there on the Laffey April 45, he begins. When the 6th plane hit, I thought it was over. But I woke up lying on the deck, ears ringing, head bleeding. But I was still conscious. I reached up and felt this thing." He taps the helmet gently. Turns out it was tougher than I was. The audience chuckles softly. Garvey's eyes glisten. "It let me crawl back to my gun mount and help save my ship. A man named Bullard made that possible. And he wasn't a soldier or a sailor. He was an engineer who thought the human head was worth protecting." The applause that follows is quiet, reverent. Afterward, reporters surround Garvey. One asks Admiral, "Do you think one invention can change the course of a war?" Garvey shakes his head. "No, it changes the course of people, and people change the war." He looks down at the Mark II on the table. "That man gave us a few more seconds. Sometimes that's all history needs." That evening, a younger naval officer visiting the event writes in his journal, "The helmet was simple, almost crude, but everyone who touched it seemed to treat it like something sacred. Maybe because it proved that courage doesn't always come from combat. It can come from compassion." He later becomes head of naval safety research, helping design the Navy's 1990s-era shock mitigation helmets for carrier crews, direct descendants of Bullard's design. The next decade brings another generation of fire. 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, sailors aboard the USS Tripoli and USS Princeton endure mine explosions that rip through their hulls. Both ships remain afloat. Once again, the after-action medical reports echo familiar words. Crew protection gear significantly reduced concussive trauma. Bullard-style suspension design remains effective under modern blast conditions. The helmets in question are lightweight Kevlar composites, but the underlying geometry, the suspended cradle, the air gap, the shock-diffusing curve is pure 1944. A naval surgeon remarks, "It's strange to think that something born in the days of prop planes still protects us in the missile age." Back in San Francisco, the E.D. Bullard Company celebrates its 75th anniversary. The factory floor hums with automated presses forming polymer shells that weigh less than 2 pounds. The logo has changed, but the philosophy hasn't. At the anniversary luncheon, Edward Bullard III, grandson of the founder, takes the podium. Behind him, a photograph of his grandfather glows on a projector screen, gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, eyes sharp and tired. "My grandfather used to say the same thing. Whenever someone asked why he obsessed over helmets," Edward III tells the crowd. "Because it's not the steel that matters, it's the second it buys you to think." He pauses, letting the words hang. "In that second, you can save a ship, a crewmate, or yourself. That's the legacy we protect." Meanwhile, at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, midshipmen studying naval engineering learn about Bullard not from a textbook, but through the simple principle etched into their course notes. Energy cannot be destroyed, but it can be redirected. Their professor, Commander Helen Park, gestures to a display slide showing an old black-and-white photograph of shipboard firemen wearing Mark IIs during the Okinawa campaign. "These helmets didn't make men invincible," she says. "They gave them the ability to keep thinking in chaos. That's what wins wars, not brute strength, but clear thought in the storm." She pauses, scanning the room. That's Edward Bullard's real invention, the preservation of thought under fire. In 2001, when the Twin Towers collapse in New York, among the thousands of first responders wearing hard hats and fire helmets, nearly half are using designs evolved directly from Bullard's suspension system. The same curved air gap, the same balance between rigidity and flexibility. A photograph, published on the front page of the New York Times, shows a firefighter emerging from the rubble, soot-caked, his helmet cracked but intact. The company logo is still there, Bullard. In the following months, journalists traced the lineage back to 1919, to mining helmets, and then to 1944, when a war in the Pacific forced a civilian to solve a military nightmare. At a memorial in 2002, an old sailor named Jameson, one of the last survivors of the St. Lo, stands before a museum display of Kamikaze wreckage. His cane trembles in his hand. He leans closer to a burned, buckled helmet marked Mark II prototype, E.D. Bullard Company. He whispers, "We weren't supposed to live through that." Then he smiles faintly. Guess someone forgot to tell him. The curators at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy add a new inscription under the display case that year. "In war, courage saves the day. In peace, design saves the future." Edward W. Bullard, 1889 to 1962. Visitors stop to read it. Some move on quickly. Others linger. The helmet, dull and simple, sits under glass, its surface warped by fire, yet somehow dignified, like a survivor who has nothing left to prove. And that is how the story ends, not with a parade, not with a monument, but with a quiet truth that outlasts all noise. When the world fell into fire, a man who never wore a uniform gave sailors the one thing no armor had ever offered: time. Time to see, to breathe, to think. And because of that, thousands lived. The rest of history is what they built afterward.